The unthinkable happened just weeks ago when a 71-year-old landlord stabbed two of his tenants, killing a 6-year-old boy and critically wounding his mother. That landlord has been charged with a hate crime in the death of the 6-year-old, as he and his mother are both Palestinian American. The ongoing Israel-Hamas war has only served to heighten the concerns of members of the Muslim community here in Chicago and across the country about their safety against a rising tide of anti-Muslim bias and hate. Joining me today to discuss the causes, effects, and potential solutions for the rise in anti-Muslim bias and activities is my guest, Ahmed Rehab, Executive Director, cair-Chicago. Welcome back to CAN TV, Ahmed.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on.
Thank you for joining me for this important conversation. First, let's give our viewers a little bit of background on CAIR. What is your mission and purpose? And I know you just told me a little bit ago, you're one of the founders.
Of cair-Chicago. Yeah. And cair-Chicago is a Chicago homegrown organization co-founded by individuals who lived and worked and studied in Chicago. It serves the Chicagoland community. It's 100% funded by the Chicagoland Muslim community. CAIR is a civil rights organization serving the Muslim community in the United States. cair-Chicago is the Chicago office of that.
Great.
It's one of the larger offices in the country, and it's been around for 19 years.
Wow. So advocacy work you do?
Absolutely.
And information and
our mission is to fight bigotry, defend civil rights, promote tolerance and understanding. And so we do that through media work, public outreach and education, policy advocacy, as well as litigation and legal work. We have interns that come in and train. We build up new leadership. So it's sort of like a full toolbox to empower the Muslim community.
Wow, terrific. Well, let's get to the topic at hand. For over a month now, there's been wall-to-wall news coverage about the current war between Israel and Hamas. But I think maybe oftentimes when we touched on this a little bit, it's one or the other. I think people don't really understand. There's a lot of history there. I know we don't have time to do all the history, but can you give us a little background on this conflict?
And it's good that you start this way, because this conflict has been around for decades, since 1947, 1948. It didn't start this year. And basically, in a nutshell, we're talking about a forced population displacement. So basically you had individuals coming in from Europe and other parts of the world or of Jewish background once the State of Israel was declared, and they had automatic citizenship by virtue of their ethnic religious background. Others who were living in that land for millennia, for centuries, of a different religious and ethnic background, namely Palestinians, Muslims, and Christians, were therefore displaced by force, moved out of their homes over time in many different ways. And they ended up being refugees in neighboring countries, sometimes within the borders of historical Palestine, sometimes in neighboring countries, or around the world as immigrants and refugees. And that has caused this whole conflict to blow out. So the problem is in several forms. There is apartheid, meaning two-tiered, three-tiered citizenship within Israel itself for Palestinian Arabs who hold citizenship in Israel. That's within Israel proper. In the West Bank, you have occupation, you have settler violence that's promoted and funded and trained by the IDF.
Right.
And then Gaza, you have the siege, and you have air raids, and you have mass massacres and murders, as we're seeing now. All of these problems are part of that larger conflict that we're talking about, and the Palestinian grievances.
Right, and the West Bank and Gaza are areas in Israel or near Israel where Palestinians have been segregated. Is that one way to put it?
That is one way to put it. A lot of the people who live in these parcels of land, in these territories, have been forced from other parts of historical Palestine. Even Gaza itself, the majority citizens of that strip are refugees from other parts of historical Palestine.
Right.
And now there seems to be a push for them to leave and move into the Sinai or somewhere else. We don't know what the full strategy is there, but we've seen this film before.
Right.
And the West Bank is the same thing. There are some who are native to it, some who are refugees who are displaced from other villages and towns within historical Palestine.
Right. So this conflict is very long-standing. There have been ups and downs. This is, of course, not the first war between Israel and Hamas. So one of the things that people who've been focusing on this issue for a long time, have been talking about is a two-state solution, a solution where you can address the conflict by agreeing that there should be an Israeli state, there should be a Palestinian state, a homeland for Palestinians. In fact, I'm just going to quote, if you don't mind, from President Biden, who recently said, "I made it clear to Israel that I think the only ultimate answer here is a two-state solution that's real. We've got to get to the point where there is ability to be able to even talk without worrying whether or not we're dealing with or they're dealing with Hamas. I can tell you, I don't think it ultimately ends until there is a two-state solution." Can you share your views or CAIR's views on the idea of a two-state solution, and can we get there?
So CAIR, within its scope and its mission, that's not the type of conversations it concerns itself with. We concern ourselves with civil rights and human rights. In my personal capacity as a thinking individual, as someone who cares about this issue, on paper, two-state solution sounds like the right way to go. In practice, it's becoming increasingly more difficult, mostly because of the Israeli governments, not just this one, but every iteration of the Israeli government, and their hawkish sort of anti-Palestinian stances that we see in terms of violence being perpetrated against Palestinians and thousands killed over time. They will argue, of course, the same from the other side, but when you look at the numbers and you look at how the land is changing, you see the momentum going in one direction consistently. And so the problem here is, so long as there's supremacy and racism, so long as there's a sense of, I am better than you, I deserve more than you because of my religion, because of my affiliation, because of my ethnic background, you're not going to be able to have a real solution. Even in a one-state solution, you're still going to have this problem of apartheid, of racism, of two-tiered or three-tiered citizenship. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is to dismantle the sense of supremacy and the sense of that there is one population that is more entitled than another to citizenship within whatever political entity exists. And that's the basis of modern secular nations. So this idea that there is an ethnocentric nation state or religious nation state is counter to our understanding of liberal secular democracies as we practice them in the West. So there's that cognitive dissonance, because we support that in Israel, but we would never support that in Europe or the United States.
Understood. And it does make resolution difficult because inherent in the religion, which is why so many secular states ban it, is discrimination, is I'm superior because I'm part of this religion.
You systemize that, and you sanction that by law and by constitution. And that, to me, is so antithetical, again, to the Western notion of secular modern democracies. So we have to sort of, debate through that and understand where we stand, because there's definitely a double standard there. And I'll say lastly, as far as my personal position, every human being currently living on this land is entitled to peace, prosperity, coexistence, and justice. And it doesn't matter to me if they're Israeli or Palestinian, if they're Jewish or Muslim. And so whatever solution can be found, I think needs to include that. And to me, that means pushing against supremacist and racist models of statehood.
I think really important, critically important point. So it's talking about bias and hate, particularly bias and hate focused against the Muslim community, which sadly has been challenged in America in the recent past. Talk about how this current conflict is impacting the Muslim community.
It's created
seeing a lot.
Absolutely. I would argue it's probably more intense than immediately after 9/11, which is a very high bar already. And that is in terms of the number of cases that are coming into our office. We've seen a 700% increase over the month before last month. So from October 7th to November 7th, if you compare that month to the month before, it's a 700% increase. We're talking about hate crimes, hate incidents, bias incidents, harassment, bullying, discrimination, and censorship. And that's the new one that we're seeing. And this is happening not just from the government type initiatives, but really from private ones as well. Corporations, hospitals, law firms, clinics, professional fellowships and associations who are punishing their members or their employees or their students, depending on which facility we're talking about, when they even express their opinions outside of the realm of that entity on social media. and they come back and they say, well, this doesn't represent our values. And it's things that are not, they're quite tame. You stand up for Palestinian human rights, but they're at a certain rally, or they use a certain slogan, or they have a certain flag. And that's enough to rescind an offer of employment, to fire someone from employment, to discipline a student. And that to me is just stunning, because that goes against the very foundational principles of America, which is First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, expression, and assembly.
Right. Well, that's really goes with some challenges. Some people have been raising the fact that people have been conflating supporting Palestine and justice for Palestinians with anti-Semitism, and that sounds like what you're talking about, a little bit what you're seeing with this censorship.
Right, that is censorship. It is attempting to silence voices who dare stand with Palestinians and who dare amplify their very just and legitimate grievances, historical and contemporary. And there tends to be a monopolized line in the media in terms of the wall-to-wall coverage in the mainstream media, as well as from statements from most, if not all, politicians. I'd say most, great overwhelming majority. And as well as these corporations and these entities that issue these letters to their members and their students and their staff that focus on only the Israeli perspective. And we have no problem, by the way, standing with the families of the hostages.
Of course.
Or decrying the civilian deaths in Israel. I mean, I would share that sentiment.
You should.
Our problem is when it stops there and there's zero of that given to the tens of thousands, many more, who are killed in Palestine by Israel and its military, with our support and our funding and our weapons and our tax dollars, including 6,000, if not more, children. And so when there's nothing said about that, no condemnation, no statements, no media coverage appropriate enough for the occasion, then we see this lopsidedness. And on top of it, when we try to fill in this gap with our own activism, our own social media, then there's punishment and there's smearing and there's censorship and doxing of students, right? And making campuses unsafe for them, and nobody does anything about it. Then we are seeing an atmosphere that isn't very American, that is more reminiscent of a post-Soviet republic type situation. And we have to say, where's the spirit of America? This is a land in which you have a right to dissent. And as the ACLU said, in moments of dissent, the way forward is persuasion, not punishment. If I see that you have a different view from mine, my best way to deal with that is to try to persuade you otherwise. It isn't to punish you and take away your rights.
Right. It does seem that there is some growing, that there are a number of groups and people who are supporting Palestinians. There have been a number of major marches, and I know there's one coming up this weekend. Does that help at all to elevate and support the position that you're talking about? It
does, and honestly, what I'm seeing right now, it's sort of, elite groups versus the mainstream grassroots movements, and you see a lot of support for Palestinians when it comes to these grassroots movements, whether it's the marches or the rallies, or whether it's the rank and file Americans. And these don't just include Muslims. These include people of various backgrounds, African Americans, and white people, and Asians, and Latinos, and Christians, and Jews. A lot of Jews are involved in this, and they're very loud, and they're very clear in their position. And so that sort of movement isn't represented by the elected officials, who seem to be more beholden to special interest than the voice of the people. And I point to a poll that came out that 66% of Americans want a ceasefire. And it seems like it's 1% or less of elected officials who want the same. 80% of Democrats, and again, if you look at the Democrat elected officials, it's probably at 5%. And so there's this huge gap between the will of the people and those who are in power on behalf of the people, that shows this democracy isn't really working on this particular file of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So to whom are they beholden if not to the people? To which special interest? And that needs to be unpacked and looked into. And lastly, when it comes to media coverage as well, it isn't really representing where people are in terms of social media. So there's also a huge gap there.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to me about this really important concept or conflict and the issues that really matter. It's really important to my audience, and I'm so grateful. So thank you for being here, Ahmed.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you for all your work that you're doing.
Thank you, and we demand a ceasefire and we pray for peace. Thank you very much.
Tonight, I'm going to defer my final thoughts to those of the 44th President of the United States. In this clip, President Obama provides a clarity of insight into the incredibly complex set of issues that underpins the ongoing crisis in the Holy Land. Few have dared to share this publicly, and we're excited to bring you his remarks. Take a listen.
Doesn't matter whether it's online or in person, there is going to be rage and anger and not just generational traumas, right? I mean, this is century-old stuff that's coming to the fore, and you've witnessed the kind of worst cruelty and tragedy that can befall people involving children and spouses and grandparents, and passions are going to be high. But what I will say is that if there's any chance of us being able to act constructively to do something, it will require an admission of complexity and maintaining what on the surface may seem contradictory ideas. That what Hamas did was horrific and there's no justification for it. And what is also true is that the occupation and what's happening to Palestinians is unbearable. And what is also true is that there is a history of the Jewish people that may be dismissed unless your grandparents or your great-grandparents or your uncle or your aunt tell you stories about the madness of anti-Semitism. And what is true is that there are people right now who are dying who have nothing to do with what Hamas did. And what is true, right? I mean, we can go on for a while. And the problem with the social media and trying to TikTok activism and trying to debate this on that is you can't speak the truth. You can pretend to speak the truth. You can speak one side of the truth. And in some cases, you can try to maintain your moral innocence by virtue of just grabbing that slice of the truth. But that won't solve the problem. And so if you want to solve the problem, then you have to take in the whole truth. And you then have to admit nobody's hands are clean, that all of us have are complicit to some degree. I look at this and I think back, what could I have done during my presidency to move this forward as hard as I tried? I've got the scars to prove it. But there's a part of me that's still saying, well, was there something else I could have done? That's the conversation we should be having. Not just looking backwards, but looking forward. And that can't happen if we are confining ourselves to our outrage.
Thank you, President Obama, and thank you, Chicago and beyond, for joining us tonight. Until next time, be well and well informed.